Capra, the director, obviously, of It's a Wonderful Life, in the 30s was probably the most successful director of his time. He had won 3 Academy Awards for directing.
Capra was known for Fantasies of Goodwill. Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, It Happened One Night, very popular films in their era.
He was working at Columbia Studios under Harry Cohen, who was the studio boss, and they both had strong personalities. They wanted to make films their own way. Capra didn't want interference from Cohen, and Cohen interfered a lot, so they butt heads a lot. And ultimately, when Capra then went off to the war and to the Single Corps, he made a series of documentaries promoting the U.S. Armed Forces as a way to counter the sort of Nazi propaganda films that were going on. So when he came back from the war, he didn't want to go back to Columbia. He wanted to start off on his own, form his own company, which is very unusual for the time for a director to then say, I'm a producer and I'm going to start my own production company. So that was very unique. He called it Liberty Films. And that was what it represented to Capra, the liberty to make the films that he wanted to make. He went in with 2 other directors, William Wyler and George Stevens, and they formed this company. They set up shop at RKO Studios and made It's a Wonderful Life there. And the RKO Encina Ranch is where they created Bedford Falls.
They would have city blocks recreated, but they would just be facades. You could see that City Hall, if you were to go there, was only 3 feet thick. It had this, important facade to it, but in reality, it was just a field beyond that area. And it could be dressed to be different times in American history. It could be a small town here or there, Midwest or the Northeast. For Bedford Falls, we were assuming that was a town in Connecticut or perhaps New Hampshire, somewhere within a short distance from New York City, since that's part of the storyline of the movie. So they would dress the town to be a typical New England town of that era, and representing Americana too. The corner drugstore, the shops on the streets, and the places that people would have grown up who saw this movie. It would be nostalgic for them to see the place, 1912, 1920 recreation, which are the time periods where the film starts.
One of the interesting things, of course, is that It's a Wonderful Life is a Christmas picture, and it's going to come out in the Christmas season. So like any other Christmas picture, you don't make it in December when it's snowing. You have to make it earlier in the year, and you have to create the look of a beautiful town under snow through a special effects process.
There were outtakes which showed tests of the town made up to look like it was in winter. And a nice thing about the tests are that they have the slates still attached to them. And to our surprise, it was shot in June of 1946.
And incidentally, it just turns out that there was a heat wave going on when they were filming the movie, 100 degrees or more. And so it was pretty miserable, actually, making the film. They used sort of practical materials that wouldn't melt under the sun, like salt and gypsum and plaster, and materials that look white but they could stand up to the heat.
And you can see a bird fly through and other things that tell you it's really not wintertime if you look at the test carefully. But it showed that under sunlight that it was going to read as snow. It was missing snow in the air, but it certainly looked like it was snow on the ground. Sometimes they might dress a small area right where people are standing with actual chipped ice or something so that it would look authentic for where it really counted, where people were making contact. But it was a whole technology, of course, of illusions, which the movies are famous for, and it was a very important illusion for the success of this film.
Weather was an important aspect of It's a Wonderful Life. In some ways, it's almost another character to the film. Obviously, it's a way that the director can use to communicate feelings or emotions while the scene is going on. The classic is it's raining and it's sad. So there's a big sequence with the run on the bank where George Bailey is not able to leave town that he had hoped. His dreams are dashed, and of course it's raining. So that supports the mood of the picture and what the characters are experiencing. Snowing is also an important part of It's a Wonderful Life. And traditionally, the way that they used to create falling snow in Hollywood was to bleach cornflakes and to drop cornflakes in front of the camera to look like snow. The problem with this is that quite often actors then would walk on the cornflakes and they would make crunchy noises, and they would have to loop their lines later, meaning that they would have to go back into the studio and re-record the actors' lines separately. Capra didn't want to do that with Jimmy Stewart because he knew that Stewart was best on his first takes, and that the re-recording process he felt would not make the most dramatic performance that Stewart was capable of producing. So he asked Russell Sherman, who was a RKO special effects man, to come up with an alternative to the bleached cornflakes technique. And he came up with a technology of repurposing firefighting foam, which is made out of a substance called foamite. And it was basically a soapy substance that was lightweight, that could be sprayed out of high-pressure hoses and then blown into the set with large fans, Ritter fans, to get the effect of snowing. And it was biodegradable, so it had a lot of advantages over previous techniques, and it was much safer for the actors to interact with. There had been other stories of different types of materials like feathers being used for falling snow, and even asbestos, where that can be dangerous. So it really was an innovation, and it's actually the same way that we do falling snow today in movies. So we use a variation of that original process.
It's a Wonderful Life was nominated for Best Sound. It didn't win the Oscar, but it was nominated. You wouldn't think a film like that would be the type of film to get a nomination. Usually you think of Best Sound going to a musical or a big action war movie or science fiction movie that has lots of loud noises in it. But if you pay attention to the movie, you'll see that they use sound in some very effective and very subtle ways. For example, there's two worlds. We're in Bedford Falls in its present day, and then we go to Potterville, which is kind of this dream into the future that Jimmy Stewart is experiencing. And they make a real contrast in sound between the two. When you're in Bedford Falls, you hear all the normal traffic and crowds and people and whatever's going on. When you're in the Potterville part of the story and Jimmy Stewart's running around trying to find out what's going on, it's very quiet, and all you hear is this isolated, cold wind in the background. It's used very subtly, but it's used to make that distinction between the nightmarish world of the future, in which it's cold and isolating to Jimmy Stewart's character, and the warmth of the real world. And, you know, wind in Hollywood movies has interesting origins because in the 30s, when they started building up sound libraries for the studios, they thought they had to create more sound effects like you would for a radio show, that you'd build a prop and you'd perform with this device, record it, and use it in the movie. And they made wind machines. And there were various types. Murray Spivak, who was a famous sound person at RKO, big achievement had been King Kong. He had a wind machine, for instance, and it's really just a hand-cranked fan. Instead of having blades on the fan, you had thin rods of bamboo. And if you turned it, you got the sound like you would get swishing a rod through the air. Except that since it's turning continuously, it's a continuous sound. And you get a sound which is very much like the sound wind does make when it blows past a telephone wire or a fence out in the desert somewhere. And so effectively on the audience, it's like music. It brings to mind the feelings that we want for that environment in the movie.
Another key contributor to It's a Wonderful Life was Joseph Walker. He is the cinematographer that worked with Capra, and had worked with Capra back at Columbia. So obviously, Capra felt very comfortable working with Walker as a creative stylist for what the film would look like. And Capra would use that ensemble cast, often in a wide shot. That way that they could talk and interact very much like a family might talk or interact at a dinner table or at an event. And then if you wanted to have emphasis, he would go for a close-up, what we call a punch-in, which is just to actually move the camera closer and then re-record that moment of the scene in close-up that he could cut to later. It's not something we do that much anymore. Today we do what's called reverse angles, which is that we go to the other side and then shoot the scene one way, then move the camera around in the other direction. So we don't really do punch-ins anymore, but Capra loved to do them. And again, it supported this idea of bringing the entire cast together so that they could do a scene as a group of people. And it's one of the important things about It's a Wonderful Life, and why we feel like it's so much a part of a family that we get to see and observe and be a part of.
Mary! Mary!
Well, obviously, one of the other fun aspects about making this film was that it does then get darker. And so the photographic style changes very significantly as well. It looks like a film noir movie. And there's a sequence when Bailey is trying to go back to his house and find Mary, and it's shot like he's a criminal. Everything is backlit. The shadows are dark. So that contrast is really an example of how these people are at the top of their form. They're masters of storytelling, and they're able to reinforce these ideas that you don't necessarily think about, but you, in your subconscious, you're feeling that, oh, something's wrong, something's not right. Another example of the photographic style between Capra and his cinematographer is this amazing shot where George Bailey finally comes to the realization that he is in this alternate world, where he runs directly toward camera into a close-up and looks directly through the fourth wall at the audience as if to say, what's going on here? It's even such a classic and admired. It's reused from time to time. Steven Spielberg used it in Raiders of the Lost Ark, for example. So just, again, another example of the beautiful storytelling through a visual concept that these two people at the top of their form were able to convey to an audience.
One of the techniques that's used in building up the soundtrack of the movie is what I call sonic counterpoint. And by that I mean that there'll be a scene, an important scene, and there'll be two things going on in that scene which are in wide contrast to each other. And because of that, it can emphasize the depth of feeling. For example, in the scene where George Bailey and Mary are falling in love while they're listening to a phone call. While we're hearing in the soundtrack this jabber, jabber, jabber conversation, we're really looking at the two of them as they stare at each other, coming closer and closer and closer together. So there's this counterpoint. They're not paying any attention to the soundtrack, what's happening at that moment. It puts great contrast, great emphasis on the dramatic point of the scene.
Working at RKO, Capra was also able to employ the services of Linwood Dunn, who was a special effects technician and major contributor to the development of a device called the optical printer. And an optical printer simply is a camera that photographs a projector. So a normal projector would have a projection lens that would project onto the screen. That lens is removed and the camera just photographs the image actually in the projector. You could then combine different scenes together and through a matting process combine matte paintings or miniatures to create new illusions. And Dunn was an expert of this process. And there are some really nice examples in It's a Wonderful Life of his work. And we know about this because at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in their library, they have the workbooks that Linwood Dunn kept. So this was a log of all of Linwood Dunn's work at RKO. And being able to go through it and looking at the section of It's a Wonderful Life, we uncovered some sequences that he worked on, some which were pretty much invisible and undetectable as illusions. One example is the Suicide Bridge was a set on a soundstage, and then they matted out the scene on the optical printer to make an area that would be reserved for a matte painting to turn a shot photographed inside to make it look like an exterior. George Bailey runs out and it looks like he's on this bridge, but half the scene is painted. It's a Wonderful Life had sort of a long running time, and so Capra went back and made some cuts to the film. And usually what happens is to make the film shorter, you cut out the establishing shots. And so we came across these shots which were unused of Mr. Potter's mansion. It's a miniature tabletop. It has lots of nice details like a no trespassing sign, and it has smoke coming out of the chimney tops. And Linwood Dunn then added falling snow over the top of it in the optical process. So that was a nice find to find that clip, as well as in the beginning looking down sort of heaven's point of view on the Bailey house. That is in the film as a quick shot, but it was a much more elaborate shot as part of a miniature tabletop where they pull back and show you the Bailey neighborhood. And again, you see smoke coming out of the chimneys and falling snow. It's just really fun to see that those shots were actually much longer in screen time and fun to see, but they saved these shots and we were able to see them.
It's a Wonderful Life was not a big commercial success when it came out. It, in fact, lost money. It was a disappointment at the box office. Audiences right after World War II, apparently, were just not comfortable watching a film that was judged to be corny and maybe too sentimental. The country had come out of the war, and there was probably a lot more pain and a lot of confrontation with reality, and that's what they kind of wanted in their movies to address. The year that It's a Wonderful Life came out, William Wyler, one of Capra's partners, made The Best Years of Our Lives, which was about the plight of soldiers returning to civilian life. And of course, that spoke to the nation in ways that were very important at that, for all time, for history's sake. Liberty Films eventually, because it wasn't successful, did not sustain itself. And so apparently the rights for It's a Wonderful Life loosened up a bit. Maybe it fell out into public domain. And when television came around looking for films, of course, here was a film that they could get, if they could get a print, that would be royalty-free, and they could run it without paying a fee. And so consequently, that was attractive. And the film got television play at Christmas time on somewhat of almost a constant basis. And it was exposed to new audiences a generation later on television. And that's where it began getting its popularity began to grow. It began to be seen as this holiday classic because of the values in it were now more recognizable, more digestible by the culture of the mid and late 1950s and into the 60s. So it became this classic only after the fact.
It's sort of ironic that William Wyler's film, The Best Years of Our Lives, was a film that he owed Goldwyn. He had to make this film before he went over to Liberty Films, which was his company. So strangely, at the Academy Awards, his film, which it's a beautiful film, it's also a wonderful movie and certainly deserves all the recognition, but it did take all the sort of Oscars away from It's a Wonderful Life, and it was the popular film of its era, whereas It's a Wonderful Life was not. And it's only through successive generations of enjoying the picture has it become popular now and today, and will continue to be a classic far beyond what's The Best Years of Our Lives is known about in the public. Everyone knows about It's a Wonderful Life now. It's part of popular culture, whereas it was not the film for its time. So at the Motion Picture Academy, there's also a archive of home movies. And we came across some home movies that were made at the wrap party for It's a Wonderful Life. And it's kind of fun to see. They had a picnic, and, for the most part, it was a wonderful experience.
This footage was shot by some family that attended the event. We don't know who, but it does show a lot of the cast and the wonderful time they had on this beautiful summer day in 1946. Here they are, the grips, the camera people, the technicians, actors that worked on the film, having a very traditional picnic. There's Carol Combs, one of the Bailey children. She's the one playing the piano, Hark the Herald Angels Sing, in the finale of the picture with her parents. And on the left is Charles Williams, one of the crew that runs the Bailey Savings and Loan, along with Mr. Martini there on the right, the proprietor of the local cafe. Here's Mary Treen. She's also part of, she was a famous character actress, supporting many roles over the years, usually playing the worldly office woman. Here's Frank Phelan, along with his lovely wife, Carol Hughes, who played Dale Arden in the Flash Gordon serials. Here's Frank Capra giving actor Jimmy Hawkins a beer at the picnic, sharing with all.
Ben, that's not a beer. Obviously, that's a Coke.
And Lionel Barrymore. Oh, grumpy old Mr. Potter's even invited to the picnic. I think they were going to roll him into the lake. Though,
I think there's some footage of that later where they roll him in the lake. But right now, everyone's friendly, so that's good.
Here's Carolyn Grimes in the arms of Jimmy Stewart. She's Zuzu, the youngest of the Bailey children.
Wouldn't it be great to have been invited to this wrap party? I'd like to go to. We don't have parties like this quite so much after a movie anymore.
No, I haven't had that. They had ice cream, they had races, they had games. Here's Jimmy Hawkins being a little muscle man for the crowd here. And watermelon was served. Typical American picnics of its time. You can see why Jimmy Stewart was called Slim here in this picture. You can see how tall and thin he really is.
He looks particularly thin here, doesn't he?
Baseball.
And the old softball game was Frank Capra getting, he wanted a home run with this picture, but all he got was a double. That's something you don't see in today's film wrap parties, Craig.
Right.
A sack race. How many times have you seen the camera crew in a sack race?
Yeah, usually it's only during production. And it looks like there's some injuries happening here,
Right.
too.
There's no safety standards for these things, too, which is what I enjoy about it. Just a free-for-all. And a three-legged race.
Again, injuries.
The crew's going down.
They're very competitive.
What an afternoon. I think there were some injuries in this. You can see here the victors, but they're on the field. They're leaving a few people. It might even be Mr. Potter laying there. I'm not
No,
sure.
that's not Mr.
Getting
Potter.
him. Are you sure that's not Mr. Potter? That's
No.
probably what they.
There's
intended.
no
Capra's kind of
There's no
triumphing
wheelchair
over
tipped
him.
over or anything, so it's fine.
And it's capped off with a nice outdoor dance. Here you see Jimmy Stewart. Possibly that's Beulah Bondi he's with. I'm not sure. But a lovely time was had by all, and proving that Frank Capra made it a wonderful life, not only for his crew, but for the rest of us as well.